Chances are, if you spent any time on YouTube trying to learn how to shoot videos with Sony cameras, you've probably heard someone say that they shoot in S-Log. And you probably immediately responded by saying, what the f is S-Log? So, because your mother would be very upset with that kind of language, we're going to clear things up in this video by talking about 4 things. What is S-Log? Why and when should you shoot S-Log? How to properly expose S-Log, as well as some practical tips and tricks to make your workflow faster and more effective. And finally, how to color grade S-Log footage. For those of you that are shooting on cameras other than Sony, this will definitely still be helpful since most camera companies have their own log profiles: C-Log, F-Log, N-Log, V-Log, etc. And the general concept is the same. But each of them probably have their own guidelines for proper exposure, so make sure to do some specific research afterwards. And a quick disclaimer for any of my super nerdy friends, the goal of this video is to achieve a practical understanding. So if you think that I may have missed some of the nitty-gritty technical aspects, that was probably on purpose. But you know what, just leave the comment anyway. It's good for the algorithm. So, secure the cup, and let's shoot some log. That sounds weird. First things first, as you so eloquently exclaimed earlier, what the f is S-Log? In order to understand S-Log properly, we need to know about dynamic range. Dynamic range is the range between the lightest and darkest areas of a scene that your camera can capture without losing detail. So if your sensor can capture 15 stops of dynamic range, but your scene has 16 stops of light between the lightest and darkest parts, you'll have to either clip the blacks or the whites, making those areas just blobs of complete black or white. This is why you'll often hear camera companies brag about how much dynamic range their sensor has, but there's a bit more to it than that. Even if your sensor can technically deal with a huge amount of information like that, you need a container that can hold all of that info. If you're shooting raw photos or videos, all of that sensor information is stored inside the file for you to access, even if you're not necessarily seeing it on the screen. That being said, most of our cameras don't shoot raw video, so in our more typical video files, or even if you're shooting JPEG photos, there's a limit to how much info we can fit. Basically, that video or JPEG container is too small for all the information, so some of it gets chopped off and you can't get it back. This is where S-Log comes in. S-Log and log profiles in general are a way to fit the most dynamic range possible from your camera sensor into the video file that you're recording without increasing the file size. It's basically a way to take all that sensor information and squish it into the smaller container of the video file. So all of that bright or dark information that may have been cut off if we just shoot in a normal mode is now squished within the clipping points of the same container. The catch here is that now the image that we see has much less contrast and saturation, and we need to stretch it back out during the color grading process until it looks pleasing to the eye. So then the question is, if we're just gonna stretch it back out after, why do we even shoot S-Log and when does it make sense? The reason that we shoot in log profiles is because it retains all of that information. Even if we choose to grade it in a way where we clip some of the blacks or whites later, we had all that information in the first place, so it was our choice. We basically had the option of using all of that info. If you shoot in a standard mode, the camera takes all of that raw information, stretches it in a way that it thinks should look good, and if anything doesn't make it into the container of that video file, it's gone for good. So here are some basic guidelines for when to shoot log, and a few times that you might not actually want to. First, if your scene has more dynamic range than what can be captured in standard mode and you want to retain as much detail as possible, shooting log is ideal. This also goes for scenes where you don't necessarily have full control over the lighting and there's a chance that the conditions will change. So anything with the sun, basically. If you have absolute control over the lighting and you can create a scene where there's less dynamic range, then maybe shooting log isn't necessary. Another factor to consider is your workflow. If you're comfortable grading log footage and have a good workflow with it, then shooting everything on a given project in the same way can make it way easier to deal with and match shots. Even if you have certain shots that might not need it, having everything be consistent can save a lot of headache. The flip side to this is if you need to turn around footage quickly. Log footage is not meant to be delivered without color grading. So if you need to cut out the color grading portion of your process in order to publish or send to a client quicker, shooting in standard mode will look finished already. For me, because I'm basically a control freak and I almost always want maximum flexibility and control with my footage, I shoot everything in log, unless I'm going to transfer it straight to my phone for posting on social media immediately. So if you're like me and you've decided, you know what, shooting log most of the time seems like a great idea, now you need to know how to properly expose it so that you get the most out of your shots. Quick note for anyone watching who isn't a Sony user, this is the section of the video that might be a bit different for you. Keep watching because the concepts will be useful, but definitely do some research on your flavor of log before you go shooting. Before we can actually figure out our exposure, we need to actually turn on a log shooting mode. On Sony cameras, this is done by going to the menus, finding picture profiles, and choosing number 7 for S-Log2 or number 8 for S-Log3. S-Log2 is a little less squished in, so it has less dynamic range in the end, but I would recommend this for Sony cameras that only shoot 8-bit footage. If you're shooting with 10-bit footage, then I recommend using S-Log3 to get the maximum dynamic range. The reason for this is because if you shoot S-Log3 in 8-bit footage, when you go to stretch out that information while color grading, it'll fall apart more easily because of the lack of bit depth. So once you've engaged your S-Log profile of choice, you'll see that flat gray looking image on your screen. Now what? Well, Sony has a super technical, fancy schmancy way that they want you to expose your image in order for it to perfectly translate back to the normal looking footage. Middle gray should be at 41%, skin tone should be between 48 and 52%, and 90% white point should be at 61%. And if that made no sense to you, that's okay, because we've got some tools built right into our camera that can help us properly expose S-Log footage without having to memorize a scientific data sheet. The first and most simple tool is called Gamma Display Assist. I highly recommend applying Gamma Display Assist to a custom button on your camera so you can toggle it on and off when you need it, but you can also find it in the menus to turn it on. Then you also want to choose the right type under Gamma Display Assist type, or just select Auto and it'll know whether you're in S-Log2 or S-Log3. Basically, this applies a transformation to your viewfinder and monitor so that you can see what your footage would look like after stretching it back out in post. It's super important to know that you are still recording that flat, dull log image. You're just using this as visual guidance. If you're in a hurry while you're out shooting, or if you find the other methods too complicated, this can be a great solution. If you can get things looking good with Gamma Display Assist on, it will generally be close enough to get a nice image in the end. That being said, I find that while using only Gamma Display Assist, I often expose my images darker than I would if I was using the other methods. This is because I personally like to use a method called ETTR, or expose to the right. This method works by getting as much of the information of your scene into the brighter parts of the image container without pushing them past clipping. The reason you might want to do this is because the brighter parts of the image are going to be cleaner. And the tool that we can use to do this is called the histogram. On Sony cameras, you should be able to hit the up or display button to cycle through the display options until you get a histogram on your screen. This is showing you all the information in your picture as a white blob, and the further the white blob is to the right, the brighter it is. The further it is to the left, the darker. So exposed to the right means to push that information over to the right, to the brighter, as much as you can before you see it clipping. Clipping on the histogram will look like all of the white parts starting to bunch up into a vertical line, and we want to avoid this if at all possible. The easiest way to avoid clipping highlights is by using the third tool, my personal favorite, zebras. Zebras are a black and white striped pattern on any part of your image that are near or above the desired exposure level, depending on how you set it up. To enable zebras, find the zebra display in the menu and turn it to on. I also recommend mapping this to a custom button for easy access, and then we're going to need to set our zebra level to the appropriate level for our picture profile. We can do this by going to zebra level in the menus, or we can add zebra level into our function menu for quick access. This is where it gets a bit tricky because the highlight clipping point is different for every picture profile. But there's an easy way to figure out your clipping point. Just enable your picture profile and then crank the heck out of your ISO until everything is completely blown out. Now go into your zebra level, and at the very bottom there should be two custom options. Choose one of them and select lower limit under type. This means anything above a certain exposure level will show those zebras. Next, start gradually moving the number up and you should see the zebras slowly shrink and shrink until at some point point, they'll just disappear. That's our clipping point. For S-Log3, the clipping point is at 94, so when we set zebras to 95+, nothing is technically exceeding that, so we get no zebras. Then what I like to do is back that off a bit to 92 or 93 to make sure that I'm leaving myself just a little bit of space. The same process can be done for any picture profile to find its clipping point, so even if you're shooting in S-Log2 or with no profile, you can sort this out to make sure you're not clipping. The catch with protecting our highlights like this is that we also need to understand when we should be clipping to properly expose the more important parts of the shot. For example, if you have a big bright sky in the background and a dark subject in the foreground, exposing so that you're not clipping the sky might leave your subject too shadowy. So you might want to choose to prioritize getting that subject a little bit brighter at the expense of clipping out some of those highlights. This is why knowing all three of these tools and being able to use them in conjunction with each other is super important. Then it's just about practice and knowing what you want from your scene. Now, if you thought we were done, you were wrong. There are still a couple other things that you need to keep in mind about how to expose when using S-Log. That whole expose to the right thing, the trick there is that ideally you would do it at your camera's base ISO for the cleanest signal and the most dynamic range. On most Sony cameras, shooting in S-Log will automatically set your base ISO to either 640 or 800. As soon as you increase that, you're bringing up noise and reducing your dynamic range. So before you go and pump your ISO up, try to use your aperture, shutter speed, or adding light to a scene to get more exposure. Then use ISO as a last resort. And now that we've got our perfectly exposed S-Log footage, we need to color correct it so it doesn't look dull, flat, and gray. When color grading log footage, we are adding an extra step to the process. Instead of just getting straight to the creative stuff to make it teal and orange or super moody, we first need to convert the log footage back to a normal level of contrast and saturation. There are three ways that we can do that depending on how you like to work. The first of which is that we can use grading tools like the curves and saturation to try to approximate how it should look. We can take the curves and move the black and white points until they're just about clipping and then apply some contrast and saturation, and generally it'll look okay. After this, we can add a layer or node depending on the software you're using and go ahead and get creative with the look. And while this way is nice and easy, it is not nearly as accurate as the other options. Log profiles don't apply their effect to exposure and color in a linear way like this, so when we try to restore it this way, we're really just guessing. I generally only use this method if I get footage that's shot in some kind of a log format, but I have no way of knowing which log format it was shot in, which doesn't happen very often. The next way we can do the conversion from log is by using a LUT. In general, all camera manufacturers offer conversion LUTs that specifically correct for the way that they created their log profile. This is a much more accurate way to convert your log footage, but it also has some limitations. When you apply a LUT, any information that ended up getting clipped by that LUT is now gone for any layer above or node after the LUT is applied. For this reason, if you're going to apply a LUT, I suggest that you have some basic exposure tools in your chain before the LUT so that you can manipulate the exposure and white balance of your clip going into that LUT. This becomes very necessary when you're using ETTR to expose your S-Log images because the Sony LUT will generally make your image much brighter. And the third way, and my personal preference to convert S-Log, is to use a color space transform tool. Within DaVinci Resolve, they have the ability to use a color managed setting within the project preferences. Then for each clip, you choose the type of footage that you're grading, and it'll automatically apply the transform for you while allowing you to still access the maximum amount of image information. Alternatively, there's also a plugin called Color Space Transform that works the same way but can be applied to a node directly. This way gives you a bit more flexibility as far as the order in which you want to apply adjustments, because you can add nodes before or after the conversion. And my personal favorite for doing this color space transform is a plugin you can buy called Cinematch, which works in Premiere, Final Cut, or Resolve. It adds an extra level of accuracy by also taking into account the individual camera sensor, not just the type of log footage. So the correction process for Sony A1 S-Log3 would be slightly different from the A7S III S-Log3, so that they would match better. The color space transform way is my favorite because it's accurate, it's flexible, and all the image information is all still there for you to use at any point. point. I do still recommend adjusting exposure and white balance going into the color space transform for the best results, similar to how we did with the LUT. Like I said before, once we've done our conversion using one of these 3 methods, we're now dealing with normal looking footage, and we can add our creative look how we like. If you're interested in seeing a start to finish color grade that I did on an entire scene with a lot more information into my process, you can check out this video here. And as always, I want to hear from you. Are you shooting in a log profile already, or are you going to start now? Leave a comment down below and let me know your thoughts on log footage. And on your way down there, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, hit the bell notification so you don't miss out on future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.